There you go. Is that? Yep. And we don't have this displayed up here.
Okay, who walks in there and say, oh, like, brilliant.
Picture thing in it. There you go.
I'm glad you're taking the track.
There you go. That looks like that's right. Yep, it's up there now. So but you have to hit the picture in picture because shouldn't I be on there from the camera?
Picture in picture, you go here.
Okay, now go back to the other screen then.
Yeah. Did he decide? Did he? No, I guess not. We didn't talk about it at all. Yeah. They have some crazy stats. Something like if a kid grows up without it,
I was pretty sure the last time he did that, hit that picture in picture thing. You think?
no, that yeah. Even if they're mom, if the business is showing what it should be showing.
And that's the camera.
Where you gonna sit there?
Yeah.
The light is on it. Is there a?
Yeah, pretty much every metric of just success and well-being. Not wild success, just success and well-being. Every measure. Significant difference between
Hey, the screen shows something about I can't read that. Something about needing to turn the camera on.
Good evening, everyone, and it's time to begin our third lesson on the lessons from church history. And I'm looking forward to this lesson. It's pretty exciting as we go through this stuff, and the feedback that I've been getting and the comments have been very pleasing to me, but that's not why I do this thing. I do this thing because I think that we have a fantastic story as a Christian church, and we continue that story even today. And so as we go through this lesson tonight, we're going to cover quite a bit of time period, but I think we're going to skip some of the low points and just hit the high points. So the first thing I'm going to do is just this. We're going to take heed. Now, heed is from an old High German word, Huta, and that sounds a lot cooler than heed. So this is just the announcements kind of thing, and I just want to remind you that if you have comments or questions, if you're live, then you can send a text to Jesse Black. I don't have his number up here. I assume that you would get it. Or Nate could give me a high sign if there's a question. If you're recording, or if you're recording, or if you're watching the recording, then just send a comment to me over here on the right side, or on the left side, my left side, or you can put a comment on YouTube or the Church Center app, and I'll try to go back and look at those sometime during the week. But we've had a couple of comments and a question that came through there, and so we'll look at that. And the last thing is the Church Center app, and I've put a couple of resources out there today, and you can look in there. You can also make comments, and it doesn't have to be about what we're having for dinner tonight. You can put all sorts of comments out there, and then there can also be discussion and questions on that, even though that really hasn't happened too much as of yet. I do want to make a comment about the two resources that I dropped into this afternoon. It's a church history podcast, and they're about 30 or 40 minutes each, and they're about the destruction of Rome, the burning of Rome. And I'll just tell you, the guy was able to spend a lot more time than I did, went into a lot more depth, and did a much better job, I'm sure. But even as I was listening to it, I thought, I'm still picking up things that happened in that event and the aftermath of that event. And then the other one is about the Jewish war, which ended in the Masada, if you will, but it also has the destruction of Jerusalem. And he does a really good job explaining a lot about why Jerusalem was so tough to take, and the Romans had a very difficult time taking that, but also some of the inside things that happened during that siege. And tonight, some objectives I'd like to do tonight. One of the questions, or one of the things that I asked is, I said, what do you like? What are you getting out of this? What are you, whatever? And they said, I really like to hear what the church was like at that period of time. And so that's one of the things I want to make sure we try to address and talk about. Also, how did it change? And we're going to cover a period of about 225 years. During that 225 years, it changed. And it's going to change even more as we move on through history. Why did it change? What were some of the things that drove that change? What challenges did they face? And then who were the people that were involved? And what did it mean to be a Christian in those days? And so we're going to move on. Hopefully we'll hit those objectives tonight. And so we're talking about the post-apostolic church. In some places they'll call it the early church. But it's a period of time that runs from about the death of John in 100 AD. And then it's going to run through the Edict of Milan. And if you don't know what the Edict of Milan, that's where Rome finally said, we're not going to persecute Christians anymore. And we'll see a little bit about that. And really, you could say that this period ends with the Council of Nicaea and when Constantine became emperor, which was around 325. And so we're going to take a look at some of that stuff more at next week when we get to that time period. But this is the time period that we're talking about right there. So if you look at that and say, what was the church like? Oh, those are the same questions. Sorry, got that one in there twice. During this time period, as this begins, the emperor was Trajan, and he's going to reign for about, 21 years? And did I do the math right? 19 years. And if you ever look at a map of the Roman Empire, it'll say this up here, in 117 AD at its greatest extent. And it was a lot due to Emperor Trajan. Emperor Trajan was if you were looking at it from just a strictly governmental thing, he was a good emperor. He was a guy that really did a good job, and they had a period of sustained peace during his reign. But as I've mentioned before, one of the things in this time period is that they really had a hard time figuring out Christians. Because were they Jewish or were they not Jewish? And then how come they're fighting with the Jews? And where did these people come from? And they couldn't figure it out. And so during this time period, since it was not a recognized religion of the Roman Empire, there would be persecutions and they would be allowed, and they would try to suppress Christianity, or they would just try to rule them. And so one of Trajan's governors, I'll just use that term, I probably don't have that right, wrote to him and he said, hey, I've got this list, all right, and it's an anonymous list and it's about all these Christians and they're not doing emperor worship. What should I do about it? And so Trajan wrote back, and this is probably his most famous quote, and he said a lot of other things too, but this would be his most famous quote. And he says to Pliny, and this is Pliny the Younger, he says, you observe proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those that had been denounced to you as Christians. For it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, and with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is, by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. But anonymous, posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. And even though he didn't persecute Christians on the scale of Domitian, and a lot of this is coming out of some of the persecution from Domitian, he did have several Christians executed, including Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch, and we'll talk a little bit more about Ignatius later on. Some of the other emperors of note during this time was Hadrian, and if you guys were to say what is Hadrian famous for, you would say his Hadrian's Wall, which is kind of a boundary between Scotland and Great Britain, and he was actually in terms of an administrative, a really pretty decent administrator. They experienced an unprecedented time of peace during Trajan's period and Hadrian's period. Now, he was also of questionable moral standards. I'll just kind of leave that there. But he was one of the guys that was in there at the time. And in terms of the reaction with the church, because of this unprecedented time of peace, the church was able to grow during this time period. And so that's kind of important to note. Decius was another guy that is of note, and he was pretty brutal in terms of persecution with the church. And he only reigned for about 3 years, or 2 years, I guess. And his time of reign, he wanted to institute emperor worship again. And so that was one of the things that he did. And we'll I don't know if we're going to get into that too much. And then the next guy is Diocletian. And Diocletian was bad news. So Decius re-implemented emperor worship. Diocletian, which follows out on him just not too much later, he was very superstitious. And things are going bad in the Roman Empire when he's in reign. And he and one of his generals or one of his governors got together and they called in the priest, and they said, we want you to tell us what's going to happen in the future, what's going on. And the story goes that the priest came in and he's looking at the entrails to figure out what's going on, and he's saying, they're not saying anything. And so they said, well, go get some more. So they go get some more and they bring them in, and the priest says, they're not saying anything. And he said, well, why not? And he says, well, because you have Christians in your household and they do the cross of Christ and they're praying to keep our gods out of these things. Well, Diocletian didn't like that. And he says, what do you mean we have people that aren't worshiping emperors? And so he instituted what's known as the Great Persecution. And it lasted, it was really severe for about 3 years, but it really lasted up until 305 when Constantine became the next emperor. And Diocletian, there's a lot of things you can say about him. There's he's pretty interesting things that go on with him. But he made a lot of good moves during the period of time, so there was a lot of peace until this happened. And then when the Great Persecution happened, it was very, very bad, to the point that some people would look at this, and that's one of the things that turned the Roman people against Diocletian, was because of the brutality that they used to persecute the Christians. Yes, sir. Mickey's.
Between 251 and 284.
So Mickey's question is the difference between 251 and 284. There are other emperors in there.
Oh,
I just didn't want to put them in here. We'd be here for another hour talking about that. And I just wanted to point these guys out in particular. The last guy is Constantine the Great. If you're aware of your history, you would know him as he was the first Christian emperor. And I'm not saying he's a good guy, but he was, if you were a Christian, that was a good thing for him to become there. All right, from the mailbag. So we had this question that came on. And this is from @JamesBlack 21289, which that's my son. But I thought I'd just put it like that. He said, when speaking about the differences in the Jewish synagogue service and the first century church, you mentioned that baptism is part of the church service. However, Jesus was baptized. Was baptism part of the Jewish practice? Is it still? And when and how did that transfer to Christian praxeology? He's going to throw a word out there. And what are the differences in theology? All right, so he's asked several questions about that. And so we'll have to call our old friend Gus Gnosis out and look at the word. And the word is baptism or baptizio. And it basically means, it's a Greek word that means to plunge, dip, or immerse. But it's really more of that putting it underwater. All right, and that's really what the gist of baptism means. So in the lesson last week, I talked a little bit about this, and I talked about the synagogue service that you'll see over here on the left side of the screen. And there were several things in there. Baptism was not one of those things. And it's still not. After I did my research, it's not part of the synagogue service in and of itself. But if you go to the first century church, it does. And so that had changed. And so so it got me looking a little bit about what happened. Where did that come from? So I wanted to look at some of the roots of that. And so in particular, I'm going to look at this thing, and there's a term that's called mikvah. And this is something, I didn't put a gnosis gux up there because this is a Hebrew term, and I couldn't get a little guy for Hebrew on that. And it doesn't translate to any word that we know. In fact, you have to go back into the Hebrew, and the Hebrew this is an amalgamation of words. And it means, in the mikvah, which is a Jewish synagogue type practice, it is an immersion in a ritual bath for both physical and spiritual cleansing, performed after childbirth, during a conversion to Judaism, and that's just part of their conversion, and other occasions that may warrant that. And so it was something that was practiced at the time. And in fact, when John the Baptist came, it wasn't the first time that people would have been familiar with that. It was a mikvah. It was showing a transition from one state to the other, but it was a ritual cleansing. Now, as I mentioned, it was a combination or amalgamation of Hebrew words. And so what they do is they'll take some of the vowels and pieces and they will combine those together. And I don't know how that works, and I don't read Hebrew. I took one semester of it in college, and I don't know how I didn't flunk the class, but I didn't get much better than that. And I said, I'm not reading right to left. So I went and took the second semester of Greek instead. But it has the following nuances. So these are nuances in the word mikvah, okay? Preparation. And so there's an anticipation. And so this morning at our service, we talked about washing in preparation for something. You're going to wash before dinner. You're going to wash your hands. So it's a washing in preparation. It also has this concept of to wait upon or tarry for. So like you're waiting. And so this is a waiting thing that you're doing as well too when you wash, because you're anticipating something, okay? And then that's a hope for alignment with the Lord's will. You know, Lord, I want to be in alignment with your will. That's part of the mikvah ceremony. And then it's also a binding together. And so it has this aspect or this nuance of you're putting something together. And so you can see that in those terms. You're putting together washing with cleansing and something even beyond that that's more spiritual. And then it also always had to do with the pool of water. And there is actually some of the terminology on this from what I read says that this mikvah had a water connotation associated with it. And even, you know, like they would draw from Psalm 23 where he mentions about streams of water. Anyway, so for both the Christians and the Jews, it is a symbol of spiritual cleansing. Now, the Christians in particular, it will evolve or did evolve into a covenant with God, symbolizing death of self, and resurrection to a new life in Christ. And you'll see that throughout from the time Jesus taught about it up until all through Acts. And then Paul will carry that on, that they will mention that, and it was not lost on the people of this time period, the early church, this period of the church, and it was a huge emphasis on that. Now, did they practice it the same way we did? Probably not. And the reason I'll say that is because as you get into these things, you'll find that they wanted people to prepare. There was that aspect of preparation for baptism. And so when the Didache, which we looked at last week, they talked about fasting before you were baptized. The one who's doing the baptizing fast and the one that's being baptized fast, and then they throw in and anybody else. So there's a preparation, and they had what was known, and you've probably heard the term catechism. They had catechumens, which were the people that were going through the teaching to become baptized, to be baptized. And so that was one of the aspects. The other was that they would separate men and women because they had very different views on body and than we have today, and they would baptize in the nude. And so that probably is not a good thing to put, that, and, so I'll just leave that where that goes. So that's some of the aspect, and there's a covenant relationship that the Christians have in regard to that. All right, so now, what was the post-apostolic church like? And it's not the apostolic as we saw in our church center app for dinner tonight. Well, just looking at the first century church again, we had these things, right? They met in homes. They had the Lord's Day that they met on. It was bishop-led. We would probably call that a pastor-led. We just changed terminologies. They had an agape meal, just like what we have here. It's a love meal, love feast. They had prayer. They would do chants of psalms and praise songs, reading Old Testament scripture, and we've kind of talked about these things. So what did the post-apostolic church? So now we're into this 100 to 300 range. All right. They met in homes, but they would also start meeting in public places because they had so many people that were showing up. And sometimes the public places had to be not the best places. And so if you go to Rome, there's the catacombs, and so they would meet in the catacombs. And so this was that period of time where they're actually meeting in the catacombs. And we're going to Rome this next year. And I said, this time I'm going to go to the catacombs. But there are shrines in there that are made out of skulls and things like that, or the people that were Christians of those days. They also met on the Lord's Day, bishop-led, agape meals sometimes. This kind of became less of a thing, and the reason is because they started having these large crowds, and now you're trying to feed 100, 500, 1,000. That's a much different, thing than the agape meals. The prayer, the chants. Another thing that they did was creeds, and they start to see the advent of creeds. You actually see some of those in the New Testament. There's one in Romans, I know. Philippians 2 has one. I think Romans 13 or 12, Mickey, we did that. And there's a creed, and so they would do these creeds, and they would chant these creeds back and forth. And you'll start to see the rise of these creeds, and we're going to next week talk about the Nicene Creed, which you may have heard about. So we'll kind of hit those, but that started becoming a thing in this time period. Reading the scriptures, the apostles' teachings, they would really teach kind of like what we do. We get the Bible out, and you have, this is what Paul said to the Romans or to the Galatians or the Ephesians, and they would read those and they would teach from that time of period. But they also did the reading. They read the writings of even more church leaders and one of the reasons, because there got to be a bigger volume of writings. And we'll kind of look at one of them tonight. And then they also had teaching, but a lot of this is focused on practice and how do you practice your religion. And that's the term that James used, was the praxology, which praxology is a Greek term, and I didn't get gnosis over that, but prax is the term for practice. So if you have a dental practice, then you practice dentist. I sure hope you're not practicing. I hope you're doing dentistry. All right. If you have anyway, so you guys kind of get the thing, or a law practice or anything like that. So that's the idea of practice. And then praxology is going to be how you would talk about correct praxology is how you correctly lived your life. And in the Didache, as we read that last week, some of the parts of that, there was a lot of emphasis about, commands, the commands of what you did do and what you did not do. Baptism and then communion, by the way, was members only. During this time period, it came to be where if you were not a Christian, if you were not a member of the church, they would ask you to leave while they did communion. And that gave rise to a lot of that thinking of like, well, what are you guys doing in there behind those closed doors? And so that's fed into some of the suspicion that other people are going to have during that time period. Jesse, is that door shining through? Or is that, okay, different light. Okay, never mind. Anyway, so that would have been one of the aspects, and we look at that and we kind of question it and think, well, what's that about? And I, again, we don't look at this period of time to validate ourselves. We're not looking back and saying, well, we got that right. Look what they did then, and we're doing the same thing today. Because if you're saying, well, I want to establish a church like they did, you can't do it, first of all. But then beyond that, you can look at the thing and say, well, what is it that we're really trying to get after here? And so that's what it is. Some of the challenges that they had in the post-apostolic church, and it's like putting a puzzle together, is they had some of the same things. They're still meshing Judaism, philosophy, Greek philosophy in particular, and their pagan religion. There's also false doctrine that starts to arrive, and we talked a little bit about that with Gnosticism. We're going to follow up on that a little bit more. Probably not tonight, but we're going to hit that next week because it's going to feed into why the Nicene Creed happened in the Council of Nicaea. They had general agreement. Put one there, I forgot. Authority. That was another one that was a challenge. Who is in charge now? All the apostles are dead. Who's in charge? All right. They had agreement on the New Testament canon by and large, and you're going to see that, and people are starting to put lists together about these are okay for us to consider as gospel. All right. And some of the books were not. And if you were looking at today and you said, well, what was it at that time? It's not what we have today. There were certain books that were not included. Revelation was probably one of the last ones that they ever put in. And also, I think it was, there was another book that, and I'm drawing a blank on that, but that was real late in becoming adopted as an authorized, if you will, part of the canon. And there were different canons, but there were some that they included. One of that was very commonly included was First Clement. And we're going to take a little bit of a look in First Clement tonight, the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermes, and some of those like that. And they're well worth going to take a read on those two, by the way. It's good for you to see some of the things that go on there. There was still prejudice and persecution, and again, we've kind of talked about that. But I do want to mention that a lot of that shaped how they reacted. And the writings you see address a lot of these things, in particular persecution. And we'll look at one man in particular. And then another challenge they faced was unity. And this was one of the things that is near and dear to my heart, is that Jesus' last prayer was a prayer that you be unified. And they already started to having some divisions over some things. And you're going to start to see the seeds of what will happen in that. And then the last one in particular, this was one of the unity problems they had, was what's known as lapsy. And lapsy is a term for those that have been persecuted and recanted their faith. And then the persecution's over, and now they say, I went back in. What do you do with those people? And that was a serious problem for that. And they had significant church issues about that. All right. And it's something that we look at today. It's like, well, what if somebody leaves the faith and then they come back? Or if they commit, we do the same thing. They commit some terrible sin, and then what do you do with that person that has broken trust with the church and, in their particular case, denied Jesus? And there were some that would say they're straight out, and then there's others that would say, which I believe is the appropriate answer, well, what about Peter? He denied Jesus. And you go, I guess he did, didn't he? 3 times he denied Jesus. And you can start to look at that and you go like, so there was quite a bit of, I'll say, healthy debate on some of those things, but that is one of the things that became a little bit more of a problem. So in come the early church fathers, and we're going to take some look at these things, all right? And there were some commonalities, and we're going to take a look at several of these guys tonight. So one of the things is just what was their teaching, all right? And then just in general, this is kind of a high view of it. One is that they talked about the good news and they talked about the gospel. That was core to a lot of what they would teach. Was they would say, there is good news. Jesus came, lived, he died, and so that good news is always there. They would also talk about the resurrection. They firmly believed that the resurrection was going to happen in their time, and they couldn't understand why it didn't even happen before then. Okay? And so that was a very common thing on that, and you'll see some differences in that will be interesting to look at. I don't know if we're going to get into that. Another is they had and by the way, the resurrection is, you even talk about Revelation, and they talk about the martyrs. They're waiting for Jesus to come and redeem them. Another one is about Christian moral living, and the Christian moral living was a big thing on there. Don't live like the pagans anymore. Don't live like we used to live. And that was a huge part of their teaching as they would do it. There was some teaching about church practices, all right? In other words, and we saw that in the Didache. They talked about the communion. They'll talk about baptism. They'll talk about other church practices and what would go on. Church organization, and another term for that is polity, but they would talk a little bit about that. And there was some teaching on church organization in this time period. That's going to cause problems later on. They had theology, and theology, we're going to talk a lot more about that next week, I hope. And theology is going to be about, what do you believe in particular about Jesus Christ? And that still is the central question. Who do you say that I am? And that is going to cause lots of issues as we run through this thing. And so they'll get into theology. And so then that's where the doctrine of the triune God, and I'll throw a term at you there that you can look forward to. Another is that they had apology, and I don't mean to say that they were saying, I'm sorry. What they were apologizing for is they were making a defense for the faith. And so they would do that and a lot of times it was directed towards pagans. And so there was a writing called Against Celsus, and Celsus was a pagan that was attacking the church. And so there was a writing that was against Celsus. And so you would have like that, and that was a defense. And then, of course, they would teach about heresy in particular. So some of the other teachings over there, they came in back. All right, some of the other teachings, some of the commonalities at this about it is they all had difficulty with Old Testament authority. And one of the reasons is this, because they were all Gentiles. All right, all these church leaders we're going to talk about, none of them were Jewish. All right, so this is the Gentiles forming church teaching. Okay, you go, okay, how do we do that? That could be some tricky, but so they all had some issues about Old Testament authority and how much you should use it, and do you have to obey the Old Testament and things like that. They used Trinitarian terms as opposed to Gnostic or Docist terms. All right, they're going to use things about God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, so they will use those terms, and they will use those pretty consistently throughout all their writings and their teachings. They agreed on church polity, or church structure, basically organization, and in particular, except for Ignatius. And Ignatius of Antioch had a different view, and that going to cause problems for the next 2,000, whatever, what is today, to today. All right, and so Ignatius was one of the ones that's going to bring in that there should be a higher level of church leader. So this particular bishop may be more preeminent or first, or he may be first among equals. And so Ignatius is going to start to teach on some of that. But they were pretty well common that bishop and deacons were it. That was all they had. Deacon is a church term that means a servant. And so really we would call them servant leaders or ministry leaders today. If you were going to try to translate that, that would probably be the best description of that. Deacon is a very churchy word, and yet you look in the Bible and you're going to find there's a deaconess, and I have yet to meet somebody that was ordained, or whatever you want to call it, a deaconess. All right, I've known a lot of women ministry leaders, though. Guess what? They were deacons, deaconess. All right, and by the way, there was no primacy. None of them pointed out primacy. All right, and I just want to throw that in there because a lot revisionist history will come back and say, yeah, there was. They placed a great emphasis on baptism as a seal with which the believers are marked out as God's people. And that's a quote that from one of them. Again, a high level of anticipation of the second coming. And it was always focused on being prepared, all right, for Jesus to come back. And in light of persecution, and so you had kind of this, if you will, kind of a dual, I don't know what the right term is, hanging over your head. You could either die because of persecution or Jesus could come. And either way, you need to be ready to meet him again. Okay? And that was it, that they had a lot of that. And then the Eucharist was clearly, the Eucharist was clearly the center of Christian worship. And I skipped this one about keeping the faith in persecution. I think you can understand that. But the Eucharist was clearly the center of Christian worship. Now, these teachers kind of split into different schools of thought. All right. Now, they're not like what we would think schools, but they generally are starting to group together by region. And so in Asia Minor, well, I did bring those guys back in. So in Asia Minor, in Syria, today's Turkey, Greece, Syria today, those kind of countries, you think of Eastern European countries, there was a school of thought there. Their teaching was stressed a lot more on union with Christ for attaining salvation. And so you see that a very strong Paul emphasis or influence, and John emphasis as well. Ignatius was one of Antioch. He said the Eucharist unites believers to the passion of Christ. All right. You start to get some of that early aspect of, and we'll kind of get into this later, is about does the communion bread and wine become the body of Christ? And Ignatius would have been one that would do that. Polycarp was a well-known disciple of John, and he was a martyr, and he has just a fantastic statement that he basically says, for 86 years I've served my Lord, why would I deny him now? And I'm paraphrasing that. Papias was a premillennialist. He believed in the 1,000-year reigns out in the future sometime. So that's not anything new. And then the Justin Martyr he was a Stoic guy, all right? So you're going to get a little bit of that from that Greek influence and such. Now the Romans, represented by Clement and Hermes, Clement of Rome, and Hermes was another Italian. He was in the Italian area. They were heavily influenced by Stoicism, all right? Heavily influenced. These guys were contemporaries with Marcus Aurelius, and so you might know him from his Roman Empire. A big stress that their teaching will be on ethics and morality. Hermes believed in this term called supererogation, and that basically has to do with you need to do more than just obey the Ten Commandments. All right, you need to do more than that. And he would teach those things, and he would say that, and this, by the way, leads to the treasury of merit and the future penitential system. So later teachers are going to say that Hermes was the first teacher of this, and so since he taught it, guess what? We need to listen to what he said, and he said it, so it's authoritative now, and it's basically saying you need to obey these laws, and then you can be penitent of those. We'll see that later become indulgences and other things that would go on, and so it's very much a step towards salvation by works. And so he was one of the early ones that would teach in that. The last school was the Alexandrian school, and anybody know where that might be? It's all going to be down in Alexander, North Africa. All right, and I would just talk about the Library of Alexander was a fantastic place. It was the place of learning, and I can't emphasize there was no more scholastic or anything else thing. They had a huge volume of books there from all over the world. They had people that would excel in translation, and so you could go in and you could bring in some language. I don't know, pick your language out, Russian, and they would have a translator that could translate stuff into Russian and translate Russian documents back. They say, oh, let's go get Mickey over here. He knows how to speak Texan. All right, so you get somebody like that, and they would bring them in like that. And then, I don't know. So they also focused on ethics, and they used allegorical interpretations of the Old Testament to try to harmonize it with the New Testament. Now, sometimes you can do that, and sometimes that's okay, and then sometimes that can get you in trouble too. All right, because sometimes the text says what the text says. But that's going to be it. So let's look at a couple of these guys. Yeah, we're doing good. All right. Justin Martyr, he lived from AD 100 to AD 165. He was an apologist and a philosopher, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him. He was born basically in Palestine, what we would know as Palestine today. He was a Greek family. He was raised in a pagan environment and was well versed in a lot of philosophical traditions. So he knew his Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle. He would have known those guys, Stoicism. Now, his conversion to Christianity occurred around 132. So he's a man of 32 years old, and he had an encounter with a Christian elder. And as it goes, we're on the beach, and so he just happens to meet this Christian elder that's on the beach. And the elder challenged his philosophical views and led him to recognize the truth of Christianity. So he became a Christian, became one of the church fathers after that, and was well known that. Now, his writings in particular have a crucial intersection of early Christianity thought and Greek philosophy. Remember, we talk about that is that Greek philosophy influenced the church and influenced Western society, period, even to today. But his in particular was about the concept of the Logos. And you're not seeing it, but I'm going to show you a couple of things. And he identified that with Christ, and he asserted that the divine reason, and so this is a very Platonic term, the divine reason is present in all truth and philosophy. So what he's saying is anything that you see out here belongs to God. So this philosophy, this goodness would belong to God. All right. He has some of the descriptions of early church worship that we've already talked about. He's best known for his apologetic works. His first apology was addressed to two emperors, Emperor Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. All right. And he defends Christianity against their accusations of atheism, immorality, impiety. And he argued that Christianity is a true philosophy and fulfills the moral and ethical teachings of earlier philosophers. Just a couple of his quotes, and we're going to do this real quick. We used to hate and destroy one another and refuse to associate with people of another race or country. Not now, because of Christ, we live together with such people and pray for our enemies. Folks, we live in a dangerous time right now. Listen to the words he's saying. We used to be that way. We're not that way anymore. Another one is whatever is rightly said by anyone in any place belongs to us Christians, because second to our devotion to God is our love of reason, which is from the self-existent and indescribable God. Now, if you don't see some Platonic influence in there, you might not know what that means, but he's basically saying this reason, the reason that Plato had, the wisdom that Plato had, belonged to God. All right? And so he said, and by the way, it's ours now. We're Christians. He says, you can kill us, but you cannot harm us. No one makes us afraid or leads us into captivity as we have set our faith on Jesus. And just a great church father, well worth reading some of his things. He also engaged in a rather lengthy thing, a thing that he published called the Dialogue with Trypho, which was a Jewish scholar. And he was trying to demonstrate Jesus the Messiah. And so if you wanted an apology for Jesus the Messiah, that's a great place to go back in it. He was arrested and executed during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And he was beheaded along with several of his students because he had a student group that he was teaching with. Next guy, I missed this quote. It wasn't on my sheet. But I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead. And so that's the way they would teach. All right. Irenaeus of Lyon, I guess he's from France. All right. And so there's still a place there. He's a theologian and a bishop, and he lived in that 125 to 177. He's known for his role in combating heresy, in particular Gnosticism. And he shaped a lot of early Christian doctrine. And his best-selling work was Against Heresy. Guess what that was about? So it's Against Heresy. A couple of quotes from Irenaeus. Error never shows itself in its naked reality in order not to be discovered. On the contrary, it dresses elegantly so that the unwary may be led to believe that it is more truthful than truth itself. So what he's saying is error, falsehood, lies dress themselves up. They don't come, and that's, you think about that, and you start going like, what's the wisdom in that? They don't come in pretending to be ugly like they are. And think about some of the things that we have to deal with today in our world, and it's the same thing. They're going to dress these things up and make it appear good. The business of Christians is nothing else but to be ever preparing for death. And so you see that emphasis on be ready to die. All right? So that big emphasis on that because that happened. The church, having received this preaching and this faith, although scattered throughout the whole world, yet as if occupying but one house, carefully preserves this faith. All right? Carefully preserves it. Clement of Rome. Not much is known about Clement, except for he was from Rome. All right? You don't get any information. There isn't anything written about Clement of Rome other than we know he's from Rome. He was a bishop in Rome, and he was said to, Eusebius said he was a co-laborer with Paul. And much later in history, I'm going to say revisionist history, said he was the bishop of Rome. So you guys see that. So later on, they'll come back and say, well, Clement was one of the popes. All right, and I'll just kind of lay that. There was no such thing at this time, but they would say that he was either, and depending on which one you say, he was either the third pope or the fourth pope. All right, even though he was serving with Paul during that time. We do have his letter called First Clement, and it's the oldest Christian writing outside of the New Testament, which I thought was fascinating to find that out. And it was written to the church in Corinth. Because guess what? They still got problems going on. And the church in Corinth was experiencing some leadership issues, and basically they had a group of bishops that were over their church, and a group of young bishops or young people came in and anointed themselves as bishops and said they were taking over the church because all those old ways, those old guys, they weren't doing it right. And so there was a little bit of a, if we were on a ship, you'd call it a mutiny. And so that was what was going on. And so he writes to this church in Corinth from Rome, and he's encouraging them to respect your bishops, and so he firmly puts that in place and talks about that, and a lot of other things were in his writing like that, but that's what he's doing. He's encouraging unity and some things like that. The letter that he writes has a lot of early church efforts about putting together the canon of the New Testament. If we get our New Testament out today, there's 27 books in it. That 27 books is called the canon of the New Testament. And I'll use that term a lot. And basically that's just what it means. So that he had a lot of influence on putting together that canon of the New Testament. Now, there were some early canon efforts that included First Clement in the Bible. So we could have had First Clement, and you would have been studying that on Sunday school if those people would have had their way. There is a problem with that, though. All right, because he had a whole chapter talking about the resurrection, and he's talking about that, and he uses an example, and he says, and consider this bird that is in the Persian Empire called a phoenix. It rises from the dead, so we can too. He's trying to say a phoenix was a real thing, and he just believed it. All right, now how would we defend that today? Because there ain't no such thing as a phoenix. It's a mythical bird, and yet he believed it, and he taught it, and he was using that as an example about the resurrection. All right, about the resurrection of people. And kind of loses itself a little bit, doesn't it? Because even though with some of the analogies on that. So that's Clement of Rome. Well worth to read, except for maybe that one chapter, unless you just want to be amused. And it's not that funny either, though. He's really trying to make a strong effort at that. This is from First Clement. But not to dwell on ancient examples, let us come to the most recent spiritual heroes. So he's talking about Christian history. Let us take the noble examples furnished in our generation. Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not only one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had finally suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance. After being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee and stoned, and after preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of West, he suffered martyrdom and under the prefects. Thus he was removed from the world and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience. This is where you know that Peter and Paul were martyred. First Clement, he's telling you that they were martyred right here. The part here that he says that Paul went to the extreme limit of the West is an indication of going to Spain, Portugal. That would have been the extreme limit of the West for them. And so that's where you get, sometimes you'll say Paul went to Spain and preached the gospel there as well. So that's Clement of Rome. That's out of his thing. So you get a lot of information about church from him. Tertullian of Carthage, North Africa again. He's going to be at that Alexandrian school. And he was a prolific Christian writer. He was known, and he was the first one to write in Latin, all right? And so, because as you started separating these East and West Empire, Greek was spoken all over the empire, but it's starting to lose its emphasis, and you're starting to see the oncoming of Latin in the Western Empire. Our language is based on Greek and Latin for a lot of things. So you look at that stuff, and so Latin is one of the things that he did that. He was a polemic, all right? And if you don't know what polemic means, it means he was one that would debate or argue forcefully on certain positions. As I read that, I thought about Charlie Kirk as a polemic. And I thought that describes him exactly as he was a polemic. He shaped a vocabulary of Western Christianity, so a lot of his terminology we use today. And his work includes apologetic treatises, moral writings, and his apology was one of the earliest defenses of the Christian faith. So a few quotes from Tertullian. See if you couldn't hear Charlie Kirk saying some of these. The first reaction to truth is hatred. All right. Truth persuades by teaching, but does not teach by persuading. You got to think about it. He turns that upside down, doesn't he? All right. Men remain in ignorance as long as they hate, and they hate unjustly as long as they remain in ignorance. That word's not ring a bell in our ears today. This was about persecution. If the Tiber rises too high or the Nile too low, the remedy is always feeding Christians to the lions. And that sounds funny, but he's like, if you're not going to throw them in the Nile or the Tiber River, says you can always get rid of Christians by feeding them the lions. That's going to be what there would be. So the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And I love that. And you've heard that terminology probably, but you didn't know that Tertullian was the one that said that. All right. And by the way, yes, so that's here. So now let's talk about Origen of Alexandria. He was the first Christian genius. All right. And I mean, this guy, he's in Alexandria. He was a precocious kid. They put him in the best schools. He excelled. He was smarter than everybody else. He was that guy. If they didn't have IQ tests, but if he would have had an IQ test, he would have been way up in the top level. And then he was, you can't even say about how much he did. It's reported that one time he was writing 7 different books, and he's dictating these books to 7 secretaries all at the same time, and they could not keep up with him. So they're going to take longer to write than it takes him to talk. And they're different topics. And he's going on and he's doing that. He's just that, his mind's working like that. And he says, okay, boom, write this down, da, 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 da. All right, so you're going to start writing this. And I'm going to say, you write this, da, da, da. And so he's going on around like that. And by the time he gets over here, he says, are you through yet? Okay, well then now, da, da, da. And he would just, his just mind was worked like that. He created this thing that was called the Hexapla, and it's a monumental 6-volume comparison of Hebrew and Greek versions of the Old Testament. All right, so by the way, nobody read Hebrew for a long time. All right, you know, when the Septuagint, which was the Greek Old Testament, that was the one that Jesus and in his time, that would have been the one that they used. It had been around for hundreds of years. Hebrew was virtually a forgotten language. He was one of the guys that's going to translate that back into Hebrew. He just got that. He just was that smart. Now, he did live an ascetic life. He didn't want to be bothered. As you can imagine, his mind is going someplace. He said, I ain't got time to sit around and talk. Let's go do it. His work on the first principles laid out foundational Christian doctrines, including the doctrine of the Trinity, free will, the preexistence of souls, and he was he was big on interpreting the scripture allegorically and was looking for deeper spiritual meanings behind biblical text. All right, and he wrote against Celsus, and that was a pretty monumental work. Some of his sayings: what good does it do to me if Christ was born in Bethlehem if he is not if he is not born again in my heart through faith? All right. One who prays ceaselessly is one who combines prayer with work and work with prayer. And the reason why we have all those we have mentioned hold false opinions and make impious or ignorant assertions about God appears to be nothing else but this: that the scripture is not understood in its spiritual sense, but is interpreted according to the bare letter. So he's saying you can't take everything literal. There are spiritual meanings to a lot of what is written. And that would have been a good example of that. All right, next is Perpetua and Felicitas. And does anybody know who Perpetua and Felicitas is? Just a roll. I know Angela does. Jesse's, I know, heard of them because I turned them on to them. If you haven't heard of Perpetua and Felicitas, this is a story that I would tell you. If you're reading it, I would say get the tissue box out. All right, and let me just I'm going to read this letter, and this document. All right, and by the way, I did put the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas on our resource app. Go read it. Anyway, it can be very moving. And so this is quotes from this. And basically, she was arrested along with some other young people. And she's allegedly 21 years old, has a baby. Her slave is arrested with her. All right. And her slave was pregnant at the time. And so there's lots of issues that are going on with some of that. But she was a new convert. Her parents, her dad in particular, was not. And she was a noble woman. And so during this time, and it was Emperor Severus was the emperor. During this time, he wanted to celebrate his birthday. And so he said, everybody needs to offer me an offering to celebrate my birthday, and wouldn't do it. And so guess what? Let's go start putting people to death. All right. And so that's kind of what's going on. And so you have this diary that she wrote. And so part of it is her diary, and part of it is basically after she was martyred, more of that story. And so this is part of her diary. Quote, while we were still under arrest, my father, out of love for me, was trying to persuade me and shake my resolution. Father, said I, do you see that vase there? For example, or that water pot or whatever it is. Yes, I do, he said. And I told him, could it be called by any other name than what it is? And he said, no. Well, so too, I cannot be called anything other than what I am, a Christian. At this, my father was so angered by the word Christian that he moved toward me as though he would pluck my eyes out. But he left and departed, vanquished along with his diabolical arguments. During these few days, I was baptized, and I was inspired by the Spirit not to ask for any other favor after the water, but simply the perseverance of the flesh. A few days later, we were lodged in prison, and I was terrified, as I had never been in such a dark hole. What a difficult time it was. With the crowd, the heat was stifling, then there was extortion of the soldiers, and to crown it all, I was tortured with worry for my baby there. These were the trials I had to endure for many days. Then I got permission for my baby to stay with me in prison. And once I recovered my health, relieved as I was of my worry and anxiety over the child, my prison had suddenly become a palace, so that I wanted to be there rather than anywhere else. One day, while we were eating breakfast, we were suddenly hurried along for a hearing. We arrived at the forum, and straight away the story went about the neighborhood near the forum, and a huge crowd gathered. We walked up to the prisoner's dock. All the others, when questioned, admitted their guilt. Then, when it came my turn, my father appeared with my son and dragged me from the step and said, "Perform the sacrifice, have pity on your baby." Hilarianus, the governor, who had received his judicial powers as a successor of the late proconsul, some other names, said to me, "Have pity on your father's gray head and have pity on your infant son. Offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperor." "I will not," I retorted. "Are you a Christian?" "Yes, I am." Then Hilarianus passed sentence on us all. We were condemned to the beast, and we returned to the prisons in high spirits. But my baby had got used to being nursed at the breast and to staying with me in prison. So I sent the deacon, Pomonius, straight away to my father to ask for the baby. But father refused to give him over. But as God willed, the baby had no further desire for the breast, nor did I suffer any inflammation. And so I was relieved from any anxiety for my child and any discomfort in my breast. I can't help but get moved by a story, because the rest of the story talks about the pain that she would have on giving up nursing, and the pain, and you can just nearly hear this baby crying, and yet she stands for Christ. And her dad is saying, "Just give it up. Come on, look at your baby here." And yet she stands for Christ. We stand on the shoulders of Perpetua. All right. That ends tonight's lesson. Are there questions or comments that you have? And I know I went through a lot of material in 225 years in 1 hour.
Yeah. I had one, and I posted it just to see if it sparked anything from anybody else. But you mentioned there wasn't any primacy up to this point. But at what point did official sanctioned teaching institutions for Christian theology appear?
So,
You had
okay, so
three schools of thought.
yeah,
And
yes.
so, not schools like we think of schools, but was there any kind of an official?
Yeah, and for those that are listening online, Nate's asked a question that I'm going to try to paraphrase it and shorten it down. At what point in history did there become and I'm going to use the term orthodox doctrine, that you adhere to these things, all right, just whatever the parameters are? Is that what you're asking?
More about teaching institutions. Where would a bishop go to learn to be a bishop?
Okay, so that's a different question. Where would a bishop go to be a bishop? And they're going to learn from those that are before them, from the bishops before them, the teachers before them. That's one of the things they're going to learn. They're going to learn from the writings. They're going to learn from the New Testament. But that's where they're going to get schooled. Just kind of like, how do we determine who are elders? You know, where do you go to school to be an elder? I missed that school, but here I am. And so that's part of it. But then there's another aspect of like, well, what determines the norm, or the, if you will, of doctrine? And that gets to be a much stickier question to answer. And by the way, we're still fuzzy on the edges of that. All right. And we're for a long time. When we start talking about the Council of Nicaea and what led up to that, I think you'll see a little bit more in that. And the Council of Nicaea, it's a fascinating story. It'll take a good part of the lesson next week. So I don't know if I answered that fully, but I muddled through some of it. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you. That anybody, Jesse or Nate, did anybody send you a question online? What's that? Just Nate. All right. I would like to post that so I can really, if you don't mind, just maybe dig into it a little bit further and make sure I hit that topic as we go further through that. It wasn't in this time period though. All right. So it wasn't this time. There was things all over the place, but you can just see it starting to form and gel, and a lot of it influenced by what's going on in their day. In their day, because of that persecution in particular, and because of coming out of Judaism and bringing in all these things that we talked about, it's pretty fuzzy around the edges, all right? But there were certain things that they held to that we still hold to today. All right? So if there are no other questions or comment, next week we're going to talk about the marriage of church and state. And my friend Brian England said, I don't know that that was a good thing. All right? And I said, if you were a Christian getting persecuted, that was a great thing. All right? So you just depends on your perspective. And that'll be another period that's even longer than what we covered tonight, from about 325 to 600. And there's a good reason for that date in there as well, too. So with that, we'll close our session tonight, and God's blessings on you as we continue through this study.